This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. In August, the world's attention shifted to the Amazon as wildfires raged across the world's largest tropical rainforest. As fires continue to burn, scientists say satellite imaging shows deforestation has increased 60% more this year than in 2018, coinciding with Brazil President Jair Bolsonaro's time in office, a man who ran on a campaign to roll back environmental protections. His take on what the satellite data shows? Bolsonaro calls it a lie. Coming up, how will deforestation paired with global warming impact the Amazon, our planet? A climate scientist from Brazil will join us. First, my guest in studio has returned recently from Brazil, where he reported for National Geographic. Scott Wallace is an associate professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut, a contributor to National Geographic, and author of The Unconquered, In Search of the Amazon's Last Uncontacted Tribes. That was the last time we spoke to talk about your book. Scott, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here again.
I wanted to focus on this article that you wrote for National Geographic. It came out just a few weeks ago. You write, the battle now underway in the world's largest tropical rainforest. It's a battle in which the agency chiefly responsible for protecting the forest finds itself increasingly beleaguered. Can you explain this battle that this agency faces and why?
So the agency is called IBAMA, and it is Brazil's Environmental Protection Agency. IBAMA, together with a couple of other Brazilian government entities, including their Indigenous Affairs Agency, FUNAI, is chiefly responsible for protecting the Amazon from illegal logging, illegal land clearing, illegal mineral prospecting, wildlife trafficking. They are the chief agency charged with protecting the Amazon.
For decades now?
For decades. IBAMA was founded actually 30 years ago, so for the past 30 years. The creation of IBAMA coincided with Brazil's return to democracy from military dictatorship and the 1988 Constitution, which is the law of the land in Brazil, a very forward-looking constitution. So IBAMA has been one of the pillars of stability in Brazil and particularly in the Amazon. But with the election of Jair Bolsonaro, who took office on January 1st this year, promising to roll back environmental protections in the Amazon, to open up the Amazon, and not only protected areas, all protected areas in Brazil right now are under review by the Bolsonaro government, including indigenous lands, which scientists say, the satellite data shows that indigenous lands are in fact the most effective barrier to deforestation in the Amazon. And so IBAMA, as the chief agency charged with protecting the Amazon, finds itself not only under fire, if you will, by its traditional enemies, the illegal loggers, the mafia groups that control a lot of the illegal activities in the Amazon, but also from the higher-ups in their own government now, with Bolsonaro in charge and the Environment Minister Ricardo Salles, who's a hand-picked Bolsonaro appointee. The Ministry of Environment is the ministry that looks over IBAMA. So agents are looking both ways. They're looking, they're facing criminals on the one hand and having to look over their shoulder on the other to see if the government has actually got their backs.
That's interesting. I couldn't help but think when I'm reading this story in National Geographic, the parallels with our president and contradicting scientists, or saying that climate scientists don't have the facts right. Even lately, this whole situation with the National Weather Service in Alabama, and where was that hurricane headed? But let's talk more about Jair Bolsonaro. You mentioned he got to office January 1st, was elected. Tell us more about him. He is described as a nationalistic president.
Right, a nationalist, a far-right leader, a former Army captain who, in fact, in a lot of his pronouncements, does not spare anything to praise the military dictatorship that reigned in Brazil for 20 years from the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s. It was the military dictatorship, in fact, that opened Brazil up to colonization through the building of the Trans-Amazonian Highway and then some other subsequent roads, main penetration arteries for colonization of the Amazon. Some of these arteries, including the Trans-Amazonian Highway today, are major focal points of deforestation and fire that we've been seeing most recently. But Bolsonaro is a populist, and he thinks that Brazil's economic recovery, is dependent on exploiting the Amazon's riches, regardless of the environmental impacts. So he's all for more ranching, more soy production, more gold and diamond mining and cassiterite and other rare minerals. He's all for opening it up. And the only thing that's really stopping him so far are the laws that are in place. But we're not sure that the institutions in Brazil will be strong enough to resist his regime.
You mentioned a recovery. So is Bolsonaro popular among the Brazilian people because they've been dealing with the recession?
He's popular. He has a sort of solid base, not unlike our president here. There is probably a third of the population, maybe a little bit more in Brazil, that's solidly behind him no matter what. And so a lot of his message appeals to a certain sector of Brazilian society. Often his prescriptions are very simplistic. People don't want to have to ponder complicated, solutions to problems. And when he says, IBAMA, he's called IBAMA an industry of fines. Let's finish off this regime of issuing fines to environmental infractors. Let's open up the forest. And so people like that kind of, seemingly like charged ahead attitude.
In studio with me is Scott Wallace, who's a contributor to National Geographic. He's also an associate professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut. He just got back from Brazil this summer. He was there for a month reporting on how IBAMA, this agency in charge of fighting this illegal logging in the Amazon, and what they're up against, including a government that does not back their actions. So tell us, Scott, when you got to Brazil, what part of Brazil were you in? And tell us a little bit about what you did there.
Yeah. So first stop is Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil, to meet with officials there. But the focal point of my reporting this summer was the state of Rondônia, which is far western, western Brazil, western Amazon, western Brazilian Amazon. It is a state renowned for deforestation and conflict over land, and has actually gained a lot of international renown back in the 1980s when the World Bank financed the main artery that crisscrosses Rondônia, and that led to what is commonly known. So this road, BR 364, that crosses Rondônia, opened up the state to massive colonization and deforestation, and led to this phenomenon that a lot of people are aware of called the fishbone effect, which is when you look at the forest from satellites, you see all these feeder roads splintering off like, fish bones off a spine. And that's a lot of what has happened in Rondônia today. Anyway, Rondônia is a really interesting and very gritty, pretty violent place. And IBAMA chose to launch a big operation there in response to an attack on a tanker truck that was bearing aviation fuel to IBAMA helicopters. It was stopped and torched in the northeastern corner of Rondônia on July 4th.
By who?
Well, presumably by people connected to the illegal timber trade, because this particular area in the northeastern corner of Rondonia, is surrounded on three sides by indigenous territories that are rich in timber and with very intact forests, especially compared to everything around there, which has been deforested since the 1980s. So in this particular area, this tanker truck was stopped and burned. The truck was carrying fuel to Ibama helicopters for an operation that they were undertaking at the moment inside one of those indigenous territories. It is expressly forbidden to log or extract resources for commercial sale from indigenous territories. But that is officials believe that this illegal timber trade coming out of the indigenous territories is has been what's feeding the sawmills in this part of Rondonia. This particular district is called Espigão do Oeste, and that's where the Ibama focused its efforts basically as a show of force following this attack on the tanker truck.
So when you traveled with them by convoy, they're heavily armed. They're
Yes.
looking for these illegal loggers, sending a message that it's you can't attack a tanker led by a government looking to enforce these laws.
Yeah.
If it's expressly forbidden to log on this indigenous lands, how has it been able to become so lucrative?
Because the people who are doing it are highly organized and have a lot of capital at their disposal. And so this was something really interesting that I learned a lot more about on this trip. Talking to police, not only was I out with Ibama, but I also got the opportunity to talk to public prosecutors, federal police chiefs in the state of Rondonia, who explained how this organization works. These are very well-capitalized operations. They have the power to corrupt and bribe bureaucrats inside the government who are issuing the papers that purport to show the timber is legal and has been taken from has been legally sourced from government-approved management plans in particular areas of forests. But what's actually happening is the timber is being looted either from indigenous territories or often in conservation units, including national parks. And then the documents that accompany this timber, that have to accompany the timber from the time it's cut to the sawmill to the moving of the timber to the commercial hubs in southern Brazil, these documents have to accompany this timber, and the documents are phony, but they have all the appearance of being legal documents. And so a lot of the timber, for example, tropical timber that comes to this country is most likely illegal, but the buyers, the importers say, hey, we have documents showing this is perfectly legal timber, when quite likely it is not.
Scott Wollaston's in studio with me here on Where We Live as we learn more about illegal logging and mining that's impacting the Amazon, leading to one of the reasons for such wide deforestation in the world's largest rainforest. When we come back from the break, I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel here on Where We Live. We're going to hear what happened on that bust that Scott Wallace was on with Ibama government officials again, going after illegal loggers. And later we're going to talk more about the wider implications of deforestation in the Amazon and for our planet. You can join us too. Here's our number, 888-720-WNPR, 888-720-9677, or you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Protecting the Amazon from further deforestation. Is it a losing battle? Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro's policies on behalf of loggers and farmers have fueled wildfires raging in the world's largest rainforest. We're learning more about this from my guest, Scott Wallace. His latest story for National Geographic details that while logging is prohibited on indigenous land in Brazil, it's become a lucrative industry. We left off, Scott, you were talking about going out with this IBAMA team, which is the Environmental Protection Agency in Brazil, to go after loggers. So what happened?
Yeah, so as we're racing across the state of Rondônia on this notorious highway BR 364, and thinking that there's some kind of element of surprise, we find out a video is being shared along the route of this convoy on social media with an interview that's being broadcast in the social media of the logging industry and those who sympathize with the local logging industry, basically announcing that IBAMA's on its way and the Minister of the Environment, Ricardo Salles, will be arriving in Espigão, the focal point of the operation, the next morning to address the people and the business concerns of Espigão. So that's how we find out that they already know we're coming, and that the environmental minister will basically be addressing the industry that IBAMA, his own people, have come to enforce the law against. And so that's how things started. And then
so they were tipped off.
Essentially. I mean, there were people in IBAMA that said, hey, they knew we were coming. From the moment that truck got burned, which was 2 weeks before, they had to know that we were going to respond. But they didn't know when, and now they knew when. So one police agent said to me, oh, great. Now that they know we're coming, they're going to pull all the equipment and their men out of the indigenous territories. We'll discover the crime, but not the criminals. And which is essentially right. In the days that followed, all these operations that IBAMA launched found illegal stashes of timber, discovered lots of dubious sourcing on the grounds of a number of sawmills around this particular area that we were in. And so I accompanied the agents as they went into half a dozen sawmills in this area really close to the indigenous territories. I flew in helicopters with them into the indigenous territories. And, there was plenty of indications of the crime, but everyone had taken off. So there was nobody was caught in the act.
This sounds like dangerous work. Are there times where members of the Environmental Protection Agency, IBAMA, are attacked?
Actually, since I was there just a couple of weeks ago, actually maybe just even last week or the week before, the IBAMA agents operating in the state of Pará came under gunfire as they were attempting to shut down several illegal mining operations, which are highly destructive operations, and they were shot at last week.
Earlier, you talked about that logging on indigenous lands is forbidden. When did it become illegal, and why?
It's actually since it's always been illegal to. Certainly since the 1988 Constitution, which guarantees indigenous people the right to use the land. The land. So 14% of Brazil has been declared indigenous territory. There are a number of demarcations, which is what you call the process of actually scoping out the boundaries and making the boundaries of an indigenous territory legal. There are many of those still in process, which the Bolsonaro government has said they're going to completely freeze. And the Bolsonaro government has said we're going to review, in fact, all the declared indigenous territories. But according to the Constitution, the indigenous people have the right to use their territory where they have traditionally lived to carry on their traditional ways of life, to sustain their traditional culture, for hunting, fishing, all the things that indigenous people do as part of their daily life, but not to commercially sell the resources in a environmentally destructive way that will impinge upon their ability to live traditionally in untrammeled wilderness regions.
The Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, talks about there being poverty and why not use this resource to better the lives of the people who live there. So talk a little bit about that situation in these tribes where some believe we need to protect this land and these resources, but others see that they can make a big bucks doing this.
So it's a spurious argument to say the indigenous people are living in poverty. The fact of the matter is that as long as their forests are intact, they have and they are free from the intrusions of loggers, miners, and outsiders looking to profit from the resources they have. Their way of life is pretty good. Granted, the Brazilian government has been negligent in terms of providing things like basic necessities that, as a result of contact with our larger world, have become necessities such as, Western medicine, maybe soap, clothing, things like that. And so part of the way this whole process of indigenous people beginning to sell off resources was because they had no money to acquire these basic goods, medicine, soap, clothing, things like that.
The situation within the tribes, though. Some believe
there are many in the tribes who wish to remain, as I said, like this, living their traditional way of life without commercial exploitation of their resources. But the lure of fast cash and the things that seem to be very attractive about our culture, flying around in planes and building big houses outside the indigenous territories and, using money for all the things that it can buy, that is an attractive lure for people. And so increasingly what you see are indigenous communities divided on this question of whether or not to exploit the resources for short-term gain or to find sustainable ways to preserve the homelands into the future.
Scott, you write that the Ibama bust that you witnessed uncovered 20 sawmills, issued fines totaling close to $1.5 million. 3 mills were definitively shut down. So are Ibama members, are they making an impact? Despite the government having a different position in terms of should this land be exploited? Why do they continue to do the work?
Well, they are having an impact. They're certainly having an impact right there where they were operating, and they've been on a big operation where they were shot at over the past several weeks in the state of Pará. It's really the only way to, if you will, kind of plug the dike, at least with a finger, to try to hold back this flood of rainforest destruction coming from so many places. So the people of Ibama, I have great admiration for them. They are incredibly dedicated, and they totally believe in what they're doing. And they'll continue to do it because there's no other choice. And it's proven to be the most effective way so far to protect the rainforest.
Scott Wallace is my in-studio guest. He's an associate professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut. He's also a longtime contributor to National Geographic. Was there this summer reporting on efforts to cut back on illegal logging and mining in the Amazon. Let's talk more about this gateway to deforestation. You write that illegal selective logging is not the principal cause of deforestation, clear cutting, or of the devastating fires that have alarmed the entire world. So a lot of us paying attention to the Amazon in August when we saw the headlines of it burning. But tell us more about how this selective logging, what it does to the rainforest, Scott.
Right. So loggers are motivated by profit, and they want to take out the most valuable timber. That most valuable timber is valuable enough to capitalize the operations required to go get it, which mean building roads, and often these are narrow roads that snake under the jungle canopy, so they are difficult to detect by aerial surveillance. To get at in a lot of parts of the Amazon, the most iconic species like mahogany and cedar have disappeared, but now ipe, which is actually very popular in this country as a material for decking, and these are beautiful trees. These are being harvested. Masaranduba, some other species that we haven't heard of, but they are precious hardwoods. So once the loggers go in and take those trees out, those trees, once they're toppled, leave gaps in the jungle canopy that allows sunlight to penetrate down to the forest floor, which dries out the forest floor and makes it more prone to fires. So that's one thing. The other thing is, perhaps more importantly, is the logging is often used then to finance the clear cutting. So once the selective logging takes place, often you'll have the money, and many times it's the same people behind the operation who have taken the trees and then will come in and raise what's left of the forest, let it dry out, and then burn it when the dry season comes. And so that's the way that deforestation is connected to illegal logging.
And then once that land is cleared, then do you have farming taking the place with this land? Yeah,
so just like the issuing of phony timber certificates, chain of custody certificates when it comes to the timber, these same people or other syndicates will traffic the land. Once they've cleared it, they will eventually issue phony documents purporting to show that they are the owners of the land, and they'll sell it. So the land is cleared oftentimes, if it's not the same person who's planning to put graze cattle on that land or plant soy. The land is divided up into lots and sold off. And oftentimes the people who buy these lots may not even be aware of the illegal provenance of the land, that this is actually public land that has been stolen by these. In Brazil, there's a common term for these people. They're called grileiros. They're land grabbers, and it's a big business in the Amazon.
We talked about the impact of logging on deforestation, but what about on the ecosystem, on the tribes, the indigenous tribes that you've gotten to know throughout your reporting career? What's the impact on them with this deforestation, these fires that continue to rage today?
The impact is very intense. Not only are they subjected to the smoke and so forth, but the clearing is going on, if not inside their own territories, which is happening in Rondônia right now. There are tribes who are living in fear because there are land grabbers trying to take their territory. And so that becomes extremely dramatic. Not only that, but in places even where there are not land grabbers who are actually trying to occupy their land and take it back and privatize it, if you will, the arrival in their territories of illegal mineral prospectors or ranchers. This has a unsettling effect in the community itself, dividing the community, provoking strife, and communities that lived in pretty much in social harmony and had their traditional ways of resolving, whatever conflicts might arise, now find themselves in a great deal of strife. especially because in a lot of cases, these people who are, entering indigenous land or working on the margins of it have are often they have hired gunmen, and there is violence that accompanies these activities, and there are threats of death that are real.
Last time we spoke again, you've written the book The Unconquered, in search of the Amazon's last uncontacted tribes. What about them? Are they continuing to be pushed out of the traditional land that they've lived on, where they've been protected? I'm just curious if you can give us an update on them.
Yeah, well, one of the scary things is we don't actually know. We don't know how they're faring this season with the fires. It's quite likely that in some places they are finding themselves on the run from the fire, and really the dry season and the burning season is only really beginning now. It's going to continue till the end of the year, and so we don't really know. But there is a great deal of concern right now. Just on Friday, a longtime collaborator with FUNAI, the Indigenous Affairs Agency, was murdered on the streets of Tabatinga, which is on the border of Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. This young man, murdered in front of his wife and baby, had been working for FUNAI in the Javari Valley for 12 years. That's the area where my book, I described the expedition into this land, the Javari Valley Indigenous Reserve in Brazil, far western Brazil, that hosts the largest concentration of isolated and uncontacted tribes in the world. And there is a great deal of concern that there is penetration going on there by poachers, wildlife poachers, timber poachers, and we don't know about how that's and illegal miners. Gold prospectors. And so was this man's work the cause or the reason for his murder? And a lot of people think that, yes, that's why he was killed. And so there's a lot of apprehension about among those who work to protect the isolated tribes, that they are in danger and the isolated tribes are too.
And when those isolated tribes are contacted or exposed to the outside world, they're also exposed to diseases.
Correct, because the uncontacted groups or the isolated groups, however you want to use the term, uncontacted is kind of a shorthand, but it basically means, they do not have immunity. One of the things it means is they do not have immunity to our germs and pathogens, and they are extremely susceptible to the diseases that evolved over millennia on the Eurasian landmass that, we brought to the Americas. They are still as susceptible to those diseases as were the tribes encountered by Christopher Columbus on Hispaniola more than 500 years ago. And so that is a great concern. The epidemics that can rip through their communities. But the people who are inclined to penetrate their territories and plunder their resources also go in there heavily armed, and they are not, they don't shy away from using violence if need be. So that's a big concern as well.
You were there in Brazil in July. What has been the impact, if at all, from the international community, whether they've criticized Bolsonaro and his policies? Has anything changed in regards to the situation you witnessed?
Well, I think so, because we've seen that the outcry over all these forest fires in Brazil has led Bolsonaro to retract his some of his statements. He actually has authorized the army to help in the putting out of these fires or in the fight against the fires. So, in fact, for example, last month, I should say, during the month of August, IBAMA, the Environmental Protection Agency, went on this big operation where they were shot at in the state of Pará. And they only went on that operation because Bolsonaro had authorized the army to go with him, the army and the federal police. Up until then, IBAMA had to suspend operations in the state of Pará because the state police, the military police of the state, refused to provide protection for them. And these areas are distant. They are dealing with very potentially violent people. It's extremely dangerous for IBAMA to launch these operations without, a heavily armed military or police escort.
My guest in studio is Scott Wallace, a contributor to National Geographic, also associate professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut, as we talk more about what's happening in the Amazon that is continuing to cause deforestation and these wildfires that have captured our attention. Now, after the break, a climate scientist from Brazil will join us to talk about the impact of deforestation, but also the wider implications for our planet. You can join us too. Our number, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucine Albathanchel. Just a quick program note. Tomorrow we have Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro in studio with us to answer your questions. She's a longtime member of Congress now for 28 years. Make sure you join us for tomorrow. Now, today we've been talking about deforestation in the Amazon and what's happening on the ground in Brazil. My in-studio guest is Scott Wallace, a contributor to National Geographic. We wanted to talk more about the long-term impacts of deforestation on the Amazon, but also our planet. So joining us now via Skype, Dr. Carlos Nobre, senior researcher with the University of Sao Paulo's Institute of Advanced Studies. Carlos, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
So let's start off and tell us more about why the Amazon is so significant when we think about implications for our planet, its role.
Yes, the Amazon, to start with, stores a huge amount of carbon in the forest, and that carbon has to remain in the forest because we are fighting the climate crisis. If all that carbon ends up in the atmosphere, the probability of not exceeding the Paris Accord targets and the planet to warm up 3-4 degrees is very high. So this is a very important ecosystem service, keeping all that carbon in the forest. And actually the tropical forests, they also remove a large amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So this is an ecosystem service of great importance to fight the climate crisis. But of course, there is more. The Amazon forest has the highest biodiversity of any place on Earth, and it's very important to maintain species. So if we lose the Amazon forest, we are going to lose hundreds of thousands of species. And last but not less important, the Amazon forest also is very important for climate stabilization in South America and also of importance to other more distant regions. The Amazon forest cools the climate. If we lose the forest, the temperature will rise 2-3 degrees in the Amazon, but also around the area surrounding the Amazon. And also rainfall patterns will change profoundly in the Amazon. Rainfall will decline 20-25%, and also in other parts of South America. So the Amazon still is the most protected tropical forest in the planet, and it should be kept as that, in fact, we should restore some of the deforested areas.
Carlos, we mentioned earlier, the satellite imaging, scientists saying that deforestation has increased more than 50% in the last year. When you hear that, and you've been a long-time climate scientist, has the Amazon, are we close to seeing it reach a tipping point?
Unfortunately, we are close to reaching a tipping point. There is a lot of research. I've been also doing the research since 1980s. The first article that we published was 1990 in Science, talking about the risk of savanization. Savanization is like a lot of the Amazon forest turning into a dry savanna, like in central South America. And we made a lot of studies, and also many other people in the scientific community in the world. And we conclude that if we exceed 25% of total deforestation in the Amazon, it will really tip towards this dry savanna. We are currently at about 17% of total deforestation in the Amazon. It seems to be not a lot, I mean, compared to tropical forests in Africa or Southeast Asia. But for the Amazon, it's very critical to maintain most of the forest. And unfortunately, my concern comes not only because of these theoretical projections, but because we are seeing the climate change in the Amazon. The dry season is becoming longer in southern eastern Amazon, over perhaps 2-3 million square kilometers, and we are starting to see the Amazon being less able to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and also we are seeing tree mortality increasing in the Amazon, also affected by these very severe droughts that we had in 2005, 2010, and 2015-16. So we are very near this tipping point, and that's why we need to stop deforestation immediately and also, in fact, restore large tracts of forest.
I'm talking with Dr. Carlos Nobre, senior researcher with the University of Sao Paulo's Institute of Advanced Studies. He's joining us today via Skype. Carlos, because we're talking to you from Brazil, I am curious what your response is to President Bolsonaro earlier calling this deforestation data or the satellite data a lie, even refusing funding from the G7.
Of course, that happened in July. And because of the president himself caring about making those statements, there were a lot of studies, immediate science-based studies, and they all confirmed that the Brazil's Institute for Spatial Research data was absolutely correct. The system that this institute developed is really, it's an early warning system. It's just to tell the law enforcement agencies, and Scott mentioned a lot about IBAMA. So this law enforcement agency receives daily something like, a few hundred warnings of places where deforestation may be taking place. And so that guides the, let's say, the law enforcement agents into their field operations. So though this system is very robust, it has been proved to be absolutely correct. So there is no point. The president was very unfortunate in calling those figures a lie, and everyone knows those figures are correct, unfortunately, showing this very high increase in deforestation rates and the consequent increase in forest fires, because, of course, most of these fires started not out of lightning strikes, but out of people setting lighting fires in these chopped down trees. So the president was very unfortunate to make that statement. But on the other hand, because he made that statement, it raised awareness globally, and perhaps the president, without knowing, he was doing something that can be beneficial to finding sustainable ways for the Amazon on the medium and long run.
We should stress that deforestation actually came down 75% from 2005 to 2014. So when you talk, Carlos, about the Amazon being close to the tipping point, what needs to change? How can this be rolled back so that this further trend doesn't continue?
Well, first, I think Scott also covered that very well. We have to really empower the enforcement agents. That was really the key reason for success from 2005 to 2014 was really law enforcement became very present, very effective. So they attacked systematically the organized crime behind all this illegal deforestation. Also, there was a lot of campaigns to help farmers and ranchers to use fire, but without letting fire to propagate into the forest. And also there was a lot of other policies, subsidies for counties which would somehow reduce deforestation. So all those things, they really worked. So we know how to reduce deforestation. And therefore, we have to empower the law enforcement agents, because this is on the short run, this is really the way to go. On the medium run, long term, we really have to find different ways to develop the Amazon. It's very clear that the current way, livestock farming, illegal logging, soy crops is very, very unproductive economically and very, very destructive. So we have to think about new ways, and they have to be disruptive, because it's not sufficient only to marginally increment productivity of livestock farming or soy crops. We have really to think of the Amazon in different terms. We have to think of the Amazon in terms of its biodiversity. Biodiversity really hides the greatest potential for development of the Amazon.
So when you're talking about putting pressure on these global businesses to cut back or on these factors that drive deforestation, not doing it in one place, but then maybe in another area of the Amazon, continuing those practices. Has that been seen, Carlos?
Well, it has been seen in some level. Let's say big trading companies like in the soy market, Cargill, Bunge, and others. They have really agreed years ago not to purchase soy coming from illegally deforested areas. This is so-called soy moratorium signed in 2006, but it really worked. Somehow it was only in Brazil, and the deforestation leaked to the Bolivian Amazon. So one has to have a global view, and also deforestation-free supply chains are very important. Consumers are very important to do a responsible consumption behavior, and also even going to investment funds. If investment funds really are very, very correct in terms of not purchasing or having deforestation-free portfolios, that would really command a new economic for the Amazon. But this is not sufficient, because even if this business becomes more environmental conscious, but still the drivers will be there for deforestation. So we have really to find new ways to harness the biological assets of the forest. Those are the greatest potentials for the Amazon.
That's Dr. Carlos Nobre. Scott Wallace is still with me in studio. Scott, did you want to respond to what he has to say about some efforts to try to curb deforestation at the levels we're seeing today?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say what an honor it is to be sharing this program with you, Carlos. I'm a great admirer of your work, and we all know how important your work is. I think I think Carlos was really right about international pressure, consumers being very conscious of the choices they make in terms of their in terms of the purchases they make. One of the things that I mentioned before is a lot of importers of timber, for example, have every reason to believe that the timber that they are importing, or they have reason to believe that it's actually legally sourced, when it's quite possible that it's not. And so it's really important, I think, for home builders as well as home buyers to press their suppliers for solid information about where their timber is coming from. For example, I think the same thing goes for, I think we're seeing, companies deciding not to purchase leather from Brazil, which is another important step as well.
I want to thank Scott Wallace for joining us, a contributor to National Geographic. We'll tweet out a link to his story, his latest story on efforts to curb illegal logging in Brazil. Scott, thank you.
Thank you.
Also joining us today, Dr. Carlos Nobre, senior researcher with the University of Sao Paulo's Institute of Advanced Studies, joining us today via Skype. Carlos, thank you for your time here on Where We Live.
Thank you very much.
Today's show produced by Lydia Brown. Special thanks to our technical producer, Kion Wolf, and Carmen Baskoff. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.